All right, welcome folks. Come on in. As I always like to say, and you're going to be probably getting tired of this joke, or you did a long time ago. I hope you didn't have any trouble finding parking and the traffic wasn't too bad. And there's plenty of room up front, so come and take the front seats. So we'll wait a couple of minutes here to let more people come in. Welcome to people who are still popping in. Always nice to have a little crowd show up for our CIR webinar series. You're welcome, Gina. So, okay, got 83 people and maybe a few more trickling in, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Experts webinar series. I'm Ken Owen, Executive Director of Channel Islands Restoration. And tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Jennifer Perry of CSU Channel Islands, and she's going to talk about the human story of California's Channel Islands. Dr. Perry is an anthropologist who is interested in cross-cultural and long-term perspectives on human and environment interactions. As a California native, she earned her bachelor's degree in anthropology and Latin American studies from the University of San Diego. After graduation, she worked in cultural resource management and later attended UC Santa Barbara, where she was awarded her master's and PhD in anthropology. She was a professor at Pomona College before joining the faculty at California State Channel Islands in 2012. Although Dr. Perry has been involved with archaeological research throughout Southern California and beyond, the majority of her work is on the Channel Islands. She first fell in love with the islands when participating in a field class on San Clemente Island in 1992. Since 1998, she has collaborated with Channel Islands National Park on projects relating to human prehistory and history of the islands from about 12,000 years ago to 50 years ago. Of her varied publications, she is the co-editor and author of Channel Islands National, what's it called? Don't answer that. There it is, California Channel Islands, the Anthropology of Human Environment Interactions. Topics of more recent publications and reports include findings from a survey of Santa Barbara Island, reanalysis of Trans-Holocene about 10,000 years ago, collections from San Clemente Island, and documentation of historic features on Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa Island. As a professor of anthropology, Dr. Perry loves teaching and connecting people with the extraordinary human history of the Channel Islands and coastal California. She's currently serving as a university administrator with responsibilities that include the oversight of the CSU CI Santa Rosa Island Research Station. In this role, she was able to support the kinds of opportunities for others that first inspired her. And as a matter of fact, when we had our autumn equinox trip out to Santa Rosa Island last year in the fall, obviously, Dr. Perry led one of the walks there for a bunch of folks and talked about her specialty. So keep in mind that your video and audio are muted. We do welcome questions. Please put those in the question and answer section. And if you can, if you have them right up front, feel free to type them in while we go along, but we're going to wait until the end to ask them. And we're going to moderate those to a degree, kind of combine them if people ask the same kinds of same question over, and have fun tonight. Let me show you another slide here. You may notice in the upper right hand corner of your screen a new logo that we're sharing this year, because this is CIR's 20th anniversary year. We started working even before then as volunteers on Santa Cruz Island, but in 2002 we got our first grant funding and became an official organization. So we do habitat restoration, contracting, environmental consulting, and environmental education. And our big accomplishment last year, biggest, I should say, because we did a lot last year, was helping to acquire the West Mesa of the San Marcos foothills, which was just about to have homes built on it. And now we're working up there steadily, and it's doing so without a budget at this point, but it's a nice problem to have. The other things that we're doing is working in the Los Padres National Forest, removing tamarisk. So those are still volunteer opportunities that are available to you if you want to work in the backcountry, volunteer in the backcountry. And we just finished a large project on the 200 acres, as a matter of fact, on the Santa Clara River with many partners on TNC, Nature Conservancy property, removing arundo. Our webinar series is available at cirweb.org/webinars. That'll show up in just a moment. We've got 11 up there now, 11 webinars, which is a fair amount of content. There's some really neat topics. So if you want to see this webinar again, or if you want to look at any of our past webinars, go and visit the page, because it's got, as I said, a lot of content on it at cirweb.org/webinars. So with all of that, I would like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Perry. And I think I just stopped sharing, didn't I? You're muted, I think, Dr. Perry.
Yes, indeed. All right. Okay, let me get this started here. Super. Can you, first of all, Ken, can you see everything okay?
Yes, it looks great.
Super. Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation tonight, and thank you for the introduction. It seems pretty odd to be talking about the human story of the islands, and I can see none of you. And so typically I'd want to have this conversation in person and have a conversation about your past experiences with the Channel Islands, because we're really talking about that community experience. So such a pleasure. I think that really the only things you need to know about me are that I'm an island addict, I admit it, and that I started my relationship with the Channel Islands and specifically engaging in archaeology 30 years ago. So my anniversary was in January, and I see this as a way to celebrate that long-term relationship and what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So what I thought I'd do is, from that 30 years of experience and working on a variety of projects across islands and looking at different time periods, is to talk about what I see as some of the common themes in the human experience across time and space. So irrespective of the group that we're talking about, the time period, the technologies involved, there are some enduring characteristics and themes that cut across those differences. And that's what I'd really like to focus on today, if you take anything away from this. Now, we're trying to compress 15,000 years into 40 minutes. So this will be an exciting endeavor. And please, I guess it will be hard to know if I'm talking too fast. I usually read cues off the audience, but I will do my best here. All right, we can all start with this idea that we all have our own experiences with the Channel Islands. And you have your own personal values, you have the cultural lenses through which you see them, and there's a lot of history that goes into that. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at the long-term impacts of human decision-making on environments. So the decisions that we make today, the values that we have, are in response to decisions that were made hundreds and thousands of years ago. So I'm fascinated by that continuity over time. And what you experience, how you experience them, how you value them is dependent upon a couple of things. It includes which island or islands you go to, who they're owned by, and the purposes for which you are there. So it's really contingent upon the activities that you're engaged in. So I include this slide to recognize the diversity in the ownership and management of the islands. That leads to very different experiences. And I also wanted to note, and we'll talk about this further, the indigenous territories that are represented here. And as I'm sure most of you know, the Northern Islands, that's the traditional territory of the Chumash, and the Southern Islands are the traditional territory of the Tongva or Gabrielino. And so on this slide are not only the current names of the islands, but also the indigenous names of the islands. And there's only one that has the same name over time, and that's Anacapa, something close to that. So really this is just to think about kind of the islands as a whole. And depending on your reasons for being out there, you may not be aware of some of the islands. So I frequently encounter this, that based on somebody's experience, they may know about the archipelago as a whole, they may not know about it at all. I've also been actively challenged by people who said I was making up the idea that there's a San Clemente Island. I must have been talking about a bar in San Clemente. So there's things like that. So just to kind of point out how we have these different values that come from our own experiences, there are plenty of people out there that the only experience they've had with the Channel Islands is going to Catalina. And in fact, a lot of people that I've met are completely unaware that Catalina is a Channel Island. They think of it as something very different. And, you know, I wanted to pick some kind of standard imagery from Avalon to convey that idea of recreation and tourism that for a number of us is so different from the rest of the Channel Islands. So, but this can lead to some interesting assumptions about what they are. We can contrast this with other experiences on the islands. And I wanted to note, for example, the military islands. All of the Channel Islands have evidence of or have been used by the military in different ways, but we have a continuation of intensive use on San Clemente and San Nicolas Islands. So I wanted to just point out, if your reasons for being out on the Channel Islands have to do with being stationed there as a military personnel, you might arrive at a completely different conclusion about the significance of the Channel Islands, of their resources. So what I couldn't resist doing was to include a photo of the back of a shirt I own. It's a t-shirt I got out at the Salty Crab bar on San Clemente, and surviving the rock, this idea of it being very isolated and so on. So, and then you have this other interesting imagery here, and I apologize, my lights just went out in my office. But you can even look at the map of the island and see what they're noting in terms of values. So there's 3 locations on the t-shirt, and they're not natural locations or topographic locations. They're the locations of very significant military operations. So I'll just point out one that's at the southern part of the island right here. Some of you may be able to name this. If we're in person, I would do this would be a pop quiz. But this is Shoba, the shore bombardment area there's been ship to shore bombardment for decades. It's one of the only places this occurs in. But it is also the location of a very rich and deep human history, including a very significant Tongva village and the remnants of rock art that are currently protected by unexploded ordnance. So that's a very striking kind of contrast. So then you can have other experiences, and this is my own encountering with San Clemente Island, starting out as a teenager, and these are my anniversary on the islands. I included a couple photos from when I was attending field school way back in the day. This is an image in the bottom left of my very own tent looking over the eastern escarpment of the island. And then, of course, the realities of living on an island, including this lovely outhouse that, yes, I cleaned regularly For those of you who have been out to San Clemente, this is Stone Station, about halfway down the island. And then one of my favorite experiences on the island had nothing to do with military operations, but this astounding fog fall that occurs at sunset. This is fog falling over the eastern escarpment of the island and falling about 2,000 feet to the ocean. Very striking. And then yet you can have other experiences that really convey that sense of isolation, being insular. And so I point out Santa Barbara Island is the smallest island. I spent a lot of time out there completely resurveying the island. And there were times in which the only people on the island were the people that are in the photo. So talk about a different experience, a different idea that stands in sharp contrast to something like Avalon. So I highlight this to, you could be thinking about your own experiences, your own value, talk about as the most important characteristics of the islands, how you talk about them with people who have never experienced them. And what we experience today is really the cumulative result of thousands of years of values and decision-making shaping the landscape, the resources and heritage of the islands. We're just simply the most recent characters in this story. So we could spend a lot of time focusing on the changes and the diversity through time and space. We could talk about variation in material culture, ranging from 12,000, 13,000 years ago to 50 years ago. And that's often what I focus on. It's something I love so much about the islands is their biodiversity and their cultural diversity. And yet I would like to complicate that story a bit. We can have an holistic one, but there's a more fascinating one. We can dive into that in terms of how people are responding to or engaging with different island environments. So one other thing to think about in terms of diversity is, what is it that's shaping the human experience? So this slide is simply a summary of some of the variables or attributes of islands that would lead to different relationships with them, regardless of time period. That includes things like island size, distance to other islands, marine habitats, travel routes. You can see that the list is long here, but all of these things will shape how people engage with the local environment and then what they're doing externally in terms of importing items, transportation, and other things. So how I like to complicate this a little bit is not so much to talk about this diversity, but again, what are the common themes across the islands and across groups? So I'm going to compress our human story into one slide. And I realize this is necessarily oversimplistic, but on this slide, I wanted to note a couple of key points in the human story of the islands. One of them being their initial peopling, at least 15,000 years ago. As you know, many of you know, some of the oldest evidence of people in North America comes from the Channel Islands. And so we don't really know ultimately what that story is, but the more we look at it, the older it is. And that's very significant. Another point is that there has been the continuous occupation of the islands by the Chumash, the Tongva, and their ancestors for thousands and thousands of years. And what an incredible testament to not just survival, but sustainable, to thriving in these environments. And we're the beneficiaries of many of these decisions. So this is incredible to look at. And then this is unfortunately punctuated by the abandonment of the Channel Islands. And that takes place at different times on different islands for different reasons. The last of which, 1850s, is the lone woman of San Nicolas Island. It's at the same time, there is an expansion of European, Euro-American interests on the islands. And there are things that precede this, but one of the most important in terms of long-term impacts was the introduction of grazing animals in the 1840s. And the work of Channel Islands restoration is very much committed to undoing the impacts of these introductions. And then finally, we get to more recent centuries where there's a diversification of activities that are taking place on the islands. So at this point, I'd like to introduce any time that there's BP on a slide, it just means before present. That's it, 13, 15,000 years ago. Let's just keep it simple. If we're talking about the indigenous heritage of the islands, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. This incredible antiquity, first and foremost. I referenced 13,000 years ago is the time period to which we have definitive evidence that includes Arlington Man, on Santa Rosa Island, but the evidence extends beyond that. It's at least 15,000 years. We can also look at the persistence of hunter-gatherer fisher societies on the islands, and it's really important to stress Tongva did not adopt agriculture until missionization. And the reason is they knew about it, but they didn't need it. They didn't have to adopt it. So that's an interesting question of what they were doing without agriculture. Now, how do we know this? We know this in part through archaeological shell middens. And those are the remnants, the discarded remnants. It could be food, it could be tools, it could be the remnants of houses. There's lots of different things you can find in middens. They're very recognizable. And I include two examples here, just briefly. The slide at the top, the image at the top is from San Miguel Island, and that's completely compacted California mussel, and that derives from wind, so wind compaction. The bottom image is from Santa Cruz Island, and it's a site that has greater complexity. And what you're looking at in the image is the remnants of a dolphin that was butchered, and that's sitting right next to different artifacts and large shellfish like wavy top or wavy turban. So we have this incredible preservation of archaeological material culture that informs this story, and this helps us extrapolate to other areas. And then we also have a lot of ethnohistoric and ethnographic information about island societies. So there's a lot to draw from in terms of the past that informs our present relationships. I wanted to further stress this, and we have two things going for us. On the Channel Islands, we generally speaking have the lack of burrowing animals that cause great harm on the mainland. So the lack of ground squirrels and gophers is such an advantage because you have preserved stratigraphic layers that tell us about continuity and change through time. And we have the lack of widespread development that allows us to look at landscapes as a whole, to look at the relationship between sites or locations. And I can go on. So while I love working on the mainland as well, most of my mainland colleagues are wildly jealous of being able to work in this context. So what do we know? What do we know about the indigenous history of the islands? And at the time of European contact, the Chumash and the Tongva were organized as what anthropologists refer to as complex hunter-gatherer fishers. And then all societies are complex in some way, but what we're specifically referring to here is that in the absence of agriculture, they were organized as chiefdoms, which is a kind of political organization that tends to be associated with farming almost exclusively. So it's an anthropological question. How could they have such complexity, or what was the reason for this complexity politically and economically? And the answer has a bit to do with fishing. So that's not our endeavor today to answer that, but I want to highlight that we're really talking about these amazing societies who really we can learn so much from in terms of how we relate to the environment today. So their entire economy was based on fishing and hunting and gathering, and I'll highlight a few of these in the ways that they connect to practices we engage in today. So then if we move forward in time and we're looking at post-contact history, we have a lot of different eras that are associated with different activities. So I just wanted to list a few of these major endeavors on the islands. They're really a microcosm of California's history, of the history of the United States, and of globalization. So really any question you want to explore, I believe, in terms of human-environment relationships, you can look at in terms of the islands. And each one of these eras could be its own presentation, and you've heard presentations on some of these. What I won't talk about is as much as I want to, I would love to talk about the military history of the islands. And they've been incredibly important to our national security through time, and especially for research and development. So I'll just leave it at that. And then we can just look at one example of this. So you can look at these different time frames in terms of indigenous history and more recent history, and see how they map onto individual islands in significant ways. So I wanted to represent Anacapa for a second, and as a smaller island, and I believe probably most everyone in this audience has been there, we can see these different iconic points in history, how critical they have been in terms of transportation, military, and so on. And then I also couldn't resist to include this image of this poor guy trying to deal with invasive plants on Anacapa. And to those of you who've been out there, we say decades later, good luck on that endeavor. And so just an interesting continuity over time. All right, so what can we learn from that? What can we summarize in terms of 15,000 years of human relationships? I'd like to make a couple of key points here. First of all, it is that the greatest adverse human impacts have occurred post-European contact. We can look at evidence of sustainable relationships with the Channel Islands over thousands and thousands of years. We can also point out moments in the past of local extinctions of birds and other things, so it's not to overly represent that, but we can say that people were sustainably living on the islands for thousands of years. And it's post-European contact that we have the greatest negative consequences. And there's a lot of that has to do with invasive species. So the final point I want to drive home about this is that there's nothing about the islands that is really truly pristine. There's a lot of folks who come from the mainland and suddenly without widespread development, they see this as this pristine wilderness. That's not the case. It has been utilized by people over time. And even the things we see as the most natural or the most inherent to it have a human touch to them. So as some of you know, foxes were here. We engage in protecting foxes, and foxes were introduced by humans minimally to the southern islands, if not the northern islands. So that's just one example. Now, I quickly want to point out the image I included here, which is of San Clemente Island. You might be saying, why am I showing this image of kind of the dry Western terraces with nothing on them? That's the point, is to really show their human story. Where this picture is taken, I'm standing on a midden that has 9,000 years of evidence. In the the midpoint of the image is evidence of Chinese abalone fishers. In the background is a building that's used for military purposes. And farther back from that is a whole area that's off limits because of unexploded ordnance due to testing. So I could not pick out a patch of that image that has not been impacted by humans in some way. All right, with this in mind then, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about what I see as common themes in the lived experience over time. And if we were here having a discussion, a roundtable, I'm sure we could come up with other examples. These are just a few things that I'd like to point out in the context of this presentation. And so I'll briefly go through them, and I'd like to show a few examples in the remaining time. So one is, how do we respond to island variability? And even the largest of the islands, the most diverse of the islands, have some limitations in terms of what's locally available. So not all things are in all locations. So what do? You either make do with what you have, you import that from somewhere else, which we see thousands of years of examples of, and then you creatively use things that you may have. So one common theme over time that I've observed is a focus on conserving materials, especially imported materials like obsidian. Obsidian does not occur locally. It has to be imported from hundreds of miles away. And we see evidence of that extending back 10,000 years. So it's a really highly conserved material. Most of the time that I see it in archaeological contexts are just little tiny pieces that are the result of retooling or resharpening, but not the artifact itself. And there's also just this really creative reuse. So we can go to the historic time period, looking at Santa Rosa Island, and one of the longtime foremen out there habitually curated or stored a lot of materials from abandoned buildings and prior projects. So a lot of wood, a lot of metal, sawed off bolts, you name it, they're still sitting in the barns there, but it's showing that same idea of creative reuse. I didn't include a photo because, well, they're not very photogenic. But it's a fascinating exploration in its own right. You're staring at something and you're realizing it was repurposed multiple times. This includes artifacts that go back thousands of years, where you can see what their original form was, and they were reused probably 5, 7, 10 more times for very different things. The next thing that I'd like to talk about, and I'll support with a number of images, is the relationship to landscapes. Over time, we see a recurrence in where people are choosing to live for similar reasons. One of those reasons would be access to fresh water. That's a dominant theme. We can also look at how people are relating to the terrain and how they're dealing with travel communication. So an island like Santa Cruz, that's not easy to walk across in a day. People say, can't you just walk across the whole thing in one day? Not so much. And so there are creative ways of dealing with that, and that persists over time. So on Santa Cruz and Santa Rosa, we have people utilizing horses well into the 20th century to travel because vehicles didn't cut it in certain areas. So just to point that out. We could also talk about relationships to seascapes, the importance of fishing and shellfish harvesting over time. We could look at boating and landing areas, a lot of recurring themes in that. And then the final point, which I'm most interested in, is how this informs our values. We could be looking at linguistics. A really interesting one is place names. We can learn so much from place names on the islands, the names of the islands, lots of examples there, but ultimately how that informs identities over time, including our own. So just to take you through a few examples of this, there are plenty of places on the islands where there's persistence over time. If it's a good location in the past, it might be a good location today for comparable reasons that might relate to freshwater, wind, you name it. If it seems like a good location now, probably was in the past, generally speaking. So one of these examples, and this was in the press several years ago, or a few years ago, was an excavation under the ranch house on Santa Rosa Island. And so, they're putting in the Park Service was putting in a foundation and encountered an archaeological site that dates back to 12,000 years ago. And that's the reference to paleocoastal, just means old coast. But artifacts were found that date to 12,000 years ago. And this is sitting right underneath, as it says here, the oldest standing wooden structure in Santa Barbara County. So it's not I'm not saying this in that there's continuous occupation, but it's revisited over time, and this is really significant. Now, what are we looking at here? So I'll resist showing you images of what we found in terms of 12,000 years ago, but point out that it's the same signature of daily life. So we can replace the materials, the types of things, with the same story of eating, of engaging with the environment, of navigating transportation. These are various artifacts we found in excavations and documentation of buildings around the ranch complex. And it's I like to look at this for a couple of reasons, including the focus on higher energy foods, sugars, and then also the reliance on abalone, which will come back a little bit later in this presentation. What I resisted is showing you the Barbie toy that we found that dates to 1986, so not historic, but definitely tells us about the history of children on the island. So really thinking about families and how they're navigating the environment. So just as another example of this, we'll go to San Clemente Island, and where I was showing you a photo previously. This is a well-known archaeological site of Eel Point. Its deposits span at least 9,000 years, if not longer. That's the reference to Trans-Holocene across the past 10,000 years. There's also evidence of historic activities related to fishing, Chinese abalone fishers, and then also military activities. In looking at the site, and I could talk forever about this location, there's evidence of houses that date back to 7,000 years ago, very significant. But what I love pointing out in the slide is this perfectly preserved chronology or stratigraphy that's the result of the lack of burrowing animals and development. What you're seeing here is a snapshot of literally 10,000 demarcated, kind of conveniently separated into 3,000 year kind of increments. And there's this one right here, right in the middle, where you can actually see that there's larger shellfish. And I'll talk about that in a second. But that's the middle Holocene. So from about 3,500 years ago to 6,500 years ago, that's depicted there, large shellfish. And then in the lower left-hand corner is exposure and excavation. And in there is evidence of dolphin butchering. There are scraper and butchering tools immediately adjacent to it. There's abalone, and then there's a whale vertebra. And if you turn that over, which we did, it's a bull. And that's something that I've read about. Up until that point, I'd read about, but I'd never seen in person a bull that's made out of whale bone. Pretty fantastic. But this is this continuous use occupation over time. And today it's a popular place for some military personnel to fish for obvious reasons. All right, but I want to point out one species in particular that's been important, and that is red abalone. And, uh, and what we see is evidence of it being harvested for thousands of years. And that depends on, the evidence of that depends on where you are at on the islands. There are subtidal species that like colder waters. And so in Northern California, they're easier to harvest because they're higher up in the tidal zones. But for where we're at, they're generally subtidal unless there are changes in water temperature. So there's an interesting signature of the dates to the Middle Holocene that I pointed out in the last slide. But for the Northwestern islands like San Miguel, Santa Rosa, there's evidence of harvesting red abalone for thousands of years. Then we can fast forward into more recent history and look at how abalone, specifically red abalone, is commercially harvested by Chinese and Japanese other abalone fishers. They're really highlighted in terms of having very different practices in terms of abalone harvesting. And then finally, we can look at the importance of red abalone today. They're grown locally for commercial purposes and specifically in Santa Barbara, and some of you might be familiar with this. So there's a continuation specifically in focusing on this species. Here's a few historic images of Chinese and Japanese abalone fishers. Japanese abalone fishers developed a hard hat technique to dive for red abalone. And so that's featured here. I've had the great pleasure of working in Mexico with longtime abalone divers and talking to some of the old timers who were using very similar techniques to obtain abalone a few decades ago. So there's a continuity still in this. Then we can look at fishing through time, and fishing is important to people for thousands and thousands of years. There's never a case where they're not fishing. Some of our oldest evidence of people on the islands relates to fishing, but there's a couple of important changes over time that allow for the expansion and intensification of fishing that really drives part of the complexity of the Chumash and Tongva societies. So a couple of things to point out is around 3,000 years ago was the introduction of a specific type of fishing technology, the circular shell fishhook, that allowed for intensification of fishing, especially in kelp beds. They work incredibly well in kelp beds. I am not a great fisher person. I can readily catch a fish with no bait using one of these replicated shell fish hooks. And the use of abalone shell, it acts as a kind of lure, that iridescence. So the accounts are that they didn't need to use bait with these, and we've tested this and this has worked. So that's a kelp bass that was successfully caught with one of these. So you can see changes in how people are relating to fishing at that time. Around 1,500 years ago, so AD 500, was the development of a new kind of boat technology, and it's very unique. And I'm sure a lot of you have looked at this. One of these plank canoes is in the Chumash Hall in the Santa Barbara Natural History Museum. There are a few other examples today. But with the introduction of plank canoes, it changes the face of a lot of things in terms of human relationships. One of the results of this is the expansion into offshore environments. So using plank canoes, they're going after tuna and swordfish. So I'm trying to imagine swordfish hunting in a plank canoe, and that's pretty darn impressive. And this swordfish was very important in terms of ceremonies and status acquisition. It wasn't just a regular mainstay of the diet because it's risky to hunt. Then we can fast forward to commercial fishing that has persisted for decades. And then I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge piracy as well as part of the amazing story of the islands, including illegal fishing activities. Here's the example of plank canoes. And the Chumash and the Tongva had very similar kinds of plank canoes, tamols for the Chumash, for the Tongva tiots. They're really an amazing local kind of adaptation, and they have a lot of advantages in spite of being very costly to build. So I just wanted to acknowledge one of our key Chumash informants, Fernando Labrado, who provided a lot of the information on plank canoes because his uncles and other family members of the Tamol in the late 1800s. So he witnessed these being constructed, and the plank canoes that are used today are in part based on the schematics of the one that he built. What are their advantages and why are they so important? They're seaworthy compared to other boat styles that we're aware of prehistorically. They're conducive to transporting people, so talking about travel. They allow for the conveyance, the movement and trade of materials and goods. You could put a lot of things in there, including stone bowls, heavy stone bowls that were exchanged across the islands. They allowed for pelagic fishing. And then finally, they conferred socioeconomic status. So whoever owned them was wealthy ultimately and could convert that into other forms of power. These are images from the first Tamil crossing in 2001 to Scorpion Anchorage, and just to give you a sense of their size and their seaworthiness. But with the introduction of the plank canoes, in many ways, there's changes in Chumash and Tongva societies that map more onto or are more similar to some of our practices today. Now we can summarize some of these changes, these impacts of changes in fishing technologies and boating. And I'm going to just focus for a couple minutes on significant changes over the past about 3,000 years, or what archaeologists like to refer to as the late Holocene. This is this time of expansion, intensification of fishing. It's associated with an increase in human population densities on the islands. And we know that at the time of European contact, we estimate there were probably about 2,000 people living on the Northern Channel Islands, about 1,000 of which were living on Santa Cruz Island, which is really hard for Southern Californians to wrap their minds around, that somewhere that we're encountering today had more people than the past than right now. Also, we can see this in terms of the changes in where people are putting their villages. There's changes around 3,000 years ago where they're prioritizing sandy beaches. And part of the advantage of that is being able to land your boats. So if you've ever seen these plank canoes up close, they have a V-shaped hole and are fairly delicate. And it's never something you would have ram into a beach like a kayak. You would lift that up, as was shown in a previous image. In addition to that, it's around 1,500 years ago, so coinciding with the introduction of the plank canoes, where there's a significant change and where villages are located. And there's villages that are established after that time that are placed in locations that are conducive to boating, but not to accessing the interior of islands. Today, there are places that you can land at, but they're very difficult to hike to. So it really stresses that there's a change in the prioritization of maritime travel and marine relationships. So I'd like to call it as a shift from coastal relationships or coastal adaptations to being fully maritime. And interestingly enough, this overlaps with our popular landing areas today. One of these being Scorpion Anchorage. We can look at the greater Scorpion area, and within Scorpion Canyon itself, we have minimally 6,000 years of evidence of human occupation. If you go to the immediate surroundings, we have 9,000 years of evidence. It is also the location of incredibly important Chumash village. And this is a location that we know historically there were chiefs, there were members of the Brotherhood of the Tamil, there were shamans, and importantly, there are a lot of Chumash tribal members today who can trace their ancestry specifically to Santa Cruz Island or Limu, and specifically to this village. So that's absolutely incredible. More recently, we have the establishment of the Scorpion Ranch. It was an out ranch of the main ranch complex and was utilized as a ranch up until more recent times, really until the 80s. And then it became part of Channel Islands National Park in the mid-90s. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks here very aware of this. But at this point in time, it's the most popular visitor destination on the Northern Channel Islands. So much like in Yosemite National Park, the greatest percentage of visitation takes place in Yosemite Valley itself. Scorpion Acreage is very comparable to that. So this is just one example of these enduring locations over time. It has been an important boat landing place for many, many years. And in traveling on boats, it's one of the first landing areas you can arrive at if you're coming from places like Ventura. So there's a logic behind this through time. All right, I'm going to contrast this though with the landscape itself. And in some cases, it would have been easier to travel by boat than by land and vice versa. There's places, if you're trying to, for example, travel from the Central Valley of Santa Cruz to the east end, and for those of you who have done this, it's not an easy enterprise. And there's a major barrier known as the Montañón. It's a ridgeline that you have to cross over to arrive at the east end. So that's featured right here on the image. This is a photograph of the Montañón itself. And then here's a map of historic features and locations. And what it points out is that it's never had a road. There's never been a road that's crossed the Montañón. It's too narrow, it's too rugged to accommodate that. So we have accounts of ranch foreman, from the 1930s talking about to take his day-long horseback ride to check on the ranch at the outranch at Scorpion. So this is I've focused a lot on research around the Montañón, thinking about the east end of the island, the relationships to the Central Valley and elsewhere, and what that meant in terms of indigenous habitation and in terms of ranch management. So this is just one image of the Montañón in an area where there's been a trail that was intentionally cut. This cut took place no more recently than the 1800s. It's marked by the U.S. Coast Survey. And so kind of thinking about how would you relate to this? How would you maintain communications? How would you get there? So you either have to hike or boat. And again, in some cases, better to boat, but you may not have access to that. More recently, in terms of the ranches, they utilized a telephone system. This was probably one of the earliest and longest in use private telephone systems in the United States. So about 100 years. And they also supplemented this by shipping by boat and also by air. So there's a really interesting history of air transportation to the islands, which I'll talk about in a second. All right, so what can we look at in terms of the more recent history? We can look at evidence of these ranch operations. And this is a project that I recently completed and was able to go over the same kinds of landscapes as I did for my dissertation 20 years ago, but for very different reasons. So we can document the remnants of hay barns and pastures, and these are examples from eastern Santa Cruz. We could relocate them based on historic maps. Looking at the place names is absolutely amazing. We can also look at water systems, and wherever you find a reliable freshwater source, you will likely find evidence of indigenous use and also use by ranchers. So that's very common on the east end. If it's reliable freshwater, you're going to see all of the above. So what I've included on this slide is just one example that comes from San Pedro Canyon on eastern Santa Cruz. And this is where a dam was put in the 1950s. It was since destroyed, but it's also near rock shelters with evidence of indigenous use. So we can look at that relationship, and then water management more recently. Also on this slide is an example of a water trough that was utilized to feed cattle on the isthmus. And we also documented that. There's some really interesting correlations with landform. I couldn't resist showing you some of the leftover telephones that are on display at the main ranch. And again, this was in operation for 100 years, pretty incredible. But to execute it, the techniques are fairly simple, and they capitalize on the knowledge of ranch hands in terms of building fence lines. And oftentimes they are built on top of fence lines. Here's a few examples of posts of the telephone system that are separate from fence lines. These are iconic examples where you still see glass or ceramic insulators. There's still wire connecting them. You can see this in the Central Valley on Santa Cruz. And they map on, again, to the landform in interesting ways in terms of what would make the most sense in terms of travel and where you would be placing fence lines. Here's a close-up of these lovely insulators. And again, the techniques are fairly simple, and this would be part of the regular ranch management. So you could comb through references to, and today we maintain these fences and we made repairs. Really a credit to Justinian care in terms of figuring this out. Right, we're going to move on though. because we're going to quickly run out of time here. But I also wanted for a moment to talk about individual signatures, the expressions of individual identities. So we're going to travel to Smuggler's Ranch House on Eastern Santa Cruz for a moment, also the location of an important Chumash village, Nanawani. And so here's a few images. Rose Greeny, who cared for the Smuggler's Ranch House. This is about 1939. And what you can see on the front of the building are remnants of graffiti. So it's constantly graffitied. And that's has been a focus of research. This is the bakery room in the Smuggler's Ranch House. And we spent some time documenting the range of graffiti on the walls. Really, really interesting. So I'll skip ahead to the drawing that we made of this, and you can start picking out the story that's being told here. So we were able to identify a number of inscriptions. They date between 1893 and 2012. Uh-oh, somebody was bad. But they really are, they tell a story about the presence of military, specifically the Coast Guard. We can look at the relationship or the significance of boaters who are going out for recreation. We can also document individual ranchers that are visiting from other islands. So you can trace it down to specific people at specific points in time and who they might be visiting. One of my favorite, and some of you may have seen this, is a piece of graffiti by Earl Ovington, who's recognized as the first airmail pilot in the United States. He moved to Santa Barbara. He established the first airport in Santa Barbara, and there's a terminal at the Santa Barbara airport that's dedicated to him. And he delivered mail to the ranches and really paved the way for that. He did visit Ambrose Guarini, and he went to Smuggler's Ranch House. So I just want you to quickly take a look at this image, including his signature. And then the plane on the bottom, what is known as the Dragonfly, was the plane in which he took the first official airmail trip, which was really just a pile of mail on his lap, and then he dropped it. So, but it was a very significant moment in time. What do we see in terms of the graffiti on the wall? This is really exciting. You first of all see that it's definitely his signature, and he's marking his first airplane trip to Santa Cruz Island. He notes the date. And what's also interesting here is there's a juxtaposition. Underneath the date is the actual plane that he flew. That's a Travel Air. It was a standard kind of airmail plane in the late 20s. But what does he depict in the image? It's not that. It's his iconic Dragonfly from his first airmail flight, including the number 13 on the back, which was his lucky number. So here he is connecting that locally historic moment to a moment of national significance. That is not lost on him in terms of these relationships. He wanted to mark this in this way. So today it's not protected or preserved. It's just sitting on the wall in a locked room. But I wanted to highlight how important this is and imagining what he was thinking about in terms of the message that he was sending into the future. So then this takes us back to thinking about our themes in the lived island experience. And we could talk about any one of these for hours and just endlessly. Instead, I just wanted to talk about this in broad brushstrokes with a few exciting examples. And so I just want to mention one more thing in terms of place names and identities. And that is, it's really interesting that on the islands, if we're looking at Indigenous dialects, there was a dialect of Chumashan that was unique to the islands. Then if we fast forward in time, during the ranching period on Santa Cruz, there was kind of a Santa Cruz Islandese that's a mixture of the different languages spoken by ranch owners and ranch hands. And there's very specific words that are used that can be traced to specific individuals or regions that they're coming from. So an example would be the historic, the hay barns on Eastern Santa Cruz are referred to as zacateras. That appears to be a word that was used in a specific region of Mexico and is probably the result of a set of ranch hands using that terminology, and then that's adopted more broadly. We can look at a multitude of examples of that really see that people are making it their own. They're developing their own identities. Now, along with this, I just wanted to include an example from Anacapa, returning to our little island. And most people are aware of its name, Anacapa, which means something like mirage or illusion. If you've spent any time staring at it, you will know why. But if we dig deeper into Chumashan names for Anacapa Island, there are many. of them. One of them refers to the Big Island, which is a mountain jutting out. There is the easternmost point of Santa Cruz. The Chumash name essentially means it points towards the big peak over there. And then also really interesting is there's a lot of names that connect the island to the importance of birds. So there's the House of the Pelicans, the House of the Seabirds. And I wanted to conclude on that to bring us full circle in terms of these common themes. These place names tell us more about how the islands were valued, the important resources, the species that are there. So in these place names, it's acknowledging the importance of birds on Anacapa Island. Then if we go to the initial creation of the National Monument in the 1930s, that was specifically Anacapa and Santa Barbara Island for the purpose of protecting bird colonies. And then we fast forward in time, recognizing the importance of these islands in terms of breeding colonies for brown pelicans and beyond. So it's really, the Chumash and place names really reflect this enduring value and importance of these islands and their values that we cherish today. So with that in mind, I think really there's only one more question to answer, and that is, what is the next chapter that we're going to write in the human story? So now I'd like to conclude there with some, of course, iconic images, but I couldn't just do a sunset. I had to include a sunrise as well. The sunrise was taken on winter solstice from Santa Cruz Island. And so it says something about my own identity and how much I cherish the islands. And I'm really interested, again, in how we move forward in our relationships in terms of stewardship. So thank you.
Okay, great. I see a question just popped in. Feel free, folks, to put your questions in the question and answer section. We usually have a lot. Jennifer, you held an audience for a long time. It was around 130 people. So that's good because they stuck with you. You know?
It's a village.
Even though you couldn't see them, they could see you. I do want to just remind people that you can watch this presentation again by going to our webpage, cirweb.org/webinars, or, and I forgot to mention this in the beginning, we were also live and still are live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. So there are copies over there as well. So with that, I'll stop the sharing here and I'll start looking at some of our questions here. Well, it was Kimberly, first off, says that was really wonderful. It's not a question, it's an explanation point. You know.
Thank you for that, because it's really hard to know what's going on. Hopefully there was some humor in there.
So yeah, and then Gary Wilkes. Let me find where you went. Oh, a lot of them coming in now. So hold on one second. Let me catch up because it keeps moving, everybody. What's the title of Dr. Perry's book? Good book from the natural history of the Channel Islands. Good book for natural history of the Channel Islands. Do you have a book?
So one of them, actually, there are quite a few that have come out recently. The book that I co-edited with a colleague who works on Santa Rosa Island and elsewhere, including Morocco and beyond. That's the archaeology of the Channel. Ooh, good question. Now I have to stare at it. I thought I had it. California's Channel Islands, the archaeology of human environment interactions. And I can. I'm not going to be capable enough to type it and answer that, but can certainly share that later. There's also some great publications in terms of historical ecology. So looking at these long-term consequences, and I can certainly provide, and I thought about this, providing a short reading list upon request. So a lot is out there at this point in time, but just navigating that. you want me to just pop in and answer some of these? Let's see.
If you like, a lot of folks are thanking you, and the thank yous keep coming in. I like Carlo's comment. Where did it go? It disappeared.
I think I'm going to pluck out and answer the question about wood really quick. So where do people get wood? Greek. One thing is we have to really think about if we can undo the layers of post-European contact. So a lot of how we view the islands is shaped by the consequences of the last several hundred years. And we know that the islands are more arid, generally speaking, than they were more well-watered. So one thing is probably looking at that there was a broader distribution of trees in some locations, so we can look at Santa Rosa Island. But more interestingly, they are in part dependent on driftwood. So the Chumash name for Santa Rosa Island, Wema or Wemat, means redwood or driftwood, which is roughly synonymous because redwood was washing down as driftwood from Central California, and that was the preferred material for their boats. I think for some obvious reasons, redwood is a really good choice. And so they were supplementing. Driftwood is incredibly important. If you read Diary of a Sea Captain's Wife, there's a lot of references to Margaret Eaton going to certain locations to either get firewood or I can't get to an area because it's choked with driftwood and so on. So it's only today that we don't see this because of deforestation and all of that. But that's kind of a two-part answer there in terms of really thinking what the local environments look like in the past, but then this preference for driftwood, because we don't, in our local area, we don't have a lot of trees that grow straight and tall. And then tar, yes, and that's a very interesting question. We know about the tar pits on the mainland. There's been a lot of archaeological discussion about where the tar is coming from, and there's been some suggestions that high quality tar was traded and controlled in some way. There are offshore tar seeps around the Channel Islands, so it could have come from a couple of places. And yes, since I just saw this pop up and it dovetails, there is a fair bit to learn from underwater archaeology. And responding to another, the comment, that one of the first comments is, what could you do with a magic wand? One of them would be to expand the underwater archaeology research, because that is a lot of where our oldest sites are located. So some of my colleagues specifically work on mapping on the underwater topography to try to figure out where some of these oldest locations of human peopling have been located.
Yeah,
so that would be great.
Yeah, wouldn't it? That's where did the first people come from? That's the big migration question that partially got answered really with Arlington Springs, man. Really. So would you like to address it? It's a big topic.
That is, and we can certainly look at what's been advocated in terms of the Kelp Highway. So folks like John Erlandson have been looking at this and really advocating for a coastal migration of people who are coming from Northeast Asia. There's a lot of commonalities and technologies and traditions across the North Pacific that is really interesting. So we could answer that from an archaeological perspective. And I think that's a really compelling argument. And we're talking about people who are very aware, they're completely adapted to coastal adaptations, and try to envision that 13 to 15,000 years ago, if you're coming down the coastline of California and coming around Point Conception, all the northern islands were one island. That would have been so attractive in terms of resources. I would pick there over some comparable or locations on the mainland. So if I had to pick between Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is windy, exposed, hard to land, and a massive island that has all the resources you need, I would pick there. So, but there's another important thing here is that we always have to honor oral histories and traditions, and recognizing that, really for the Chumash and to some extent for the Tongva, which that becomes more complicated, we can really say, for some, they would argue they originate on the islands. That is where perhaps we could argue that some elements of what is Chumashan or Tongvan is born. So I just want to also acknowledge that answer as well. But
yeah,
really,
Chumash history, the people started on Santa Cruz Island and then migrated to the mainland on the Rainbow Bridge.
Yeah, and the element of that I think is the most interesting is that a lot of us were, what we learned in our books and our stories was that the first people to come into North America are via the the Bering Land Bridge, and they're following mammoths, and they're these big game hunters, and it's very gendered and all of that. And then they figure their way out down the, into the interior, and then they have to adapt to coastal settings because that's so confusing. And it's really, I realize how that was arrived at in terms of the evidence, but it's ultimately insulting in terms of people's intelligence, their abilities, and what we know is they are, again, fully adapted to living in a coastal environment. They are not figuring this out later. They're coming at, our oldest evidence on the islands is of fishing and other relationships to the marine environment. So yeah, what else do we have?
That one here by Anonymous is, do you have any suggestions the best way to balance land use, conservation, restoration, education, recreation, etc.? It seems so daunting, all these potential uses.
That's a great question, and we grapple with that all the time. And as resource managers, or however we enter into this, again, we come with laden with our own values and priorities that complicates this. So it's very much a value-based system. So how do we get at objective measures? What are we trying to restore environments to? What are the baselines that we're engaging with? And so we can really look at, a really important thing is historical ecology, where we can look at evidence over time. So one indicator is can we see, and this is dependent on time, but can we see continuity in terms of certain habitats or certain species over time? So, can we see a 1,000-year record of the presence of a particular species that would help us inform, is that something we might want to introduce into the ecosystem? So right now there's an interesting question of whether to introduce island jays to Santa Rosa Island. And that's a difficult one because we don't have the archaeological evidence, and that makes sense. We wouldn't see it. Whereas other species we can see in the archaeological record and say, this has been around a long time. So that's not an answer of how you balance it, but there's data sets that you can invoke to really arrive at or try to converge on a solution that makes sense to navigate all of these priorities. The thing is, I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that we're part of that human story. If you're talking about that we are somehow outside of these environments, that humans of a wilderness, that's deeply problematic. And there are tired tropes that divide nature and culture. What the islands tell us is that we can be successful in our relationships with them as long as we acknowledge that we're very much part of them. So that's a more philosophical approach. But if you're sitting there and saying, I'm outside of this, or we're restoring this to something that is pre-human impact, that gets a little absurd. So then we'd have to reverse engineer mammoths, and we'd have to do some pretty crazy things. And what's the point? Because that is not the character of the islands today.
I always thought it fun to bring back the pygmy mammoth stuff, but actually, as I remember, there was fossil evidence of scrub jays on Santa Rosa Island. So yeah, that's part of the reason that, but then there's a big question about whether the oak population would support reintroduction. And the other answer I throw in there is some thought about climate change and what are the islands going to turn into over time, climate-wise, and as far as their ecology. And finally, the other thought is there's been some thought put to potentially moving some of the rare plants that are found only on one island and translocating them to another island, even if they didn't grow there previously, just to make for a bigger population so that some disaster doesn't knock them out. Richard Marks wants to know what the status of the lone woman's cave and her artifacts on San Nicolas Island are or is? What's the status of those? Do you know?
So really before, I can't resist but to point out, if we're talking about relocating species to other islands, the consistency there is that people are constantly moving things. I just wanted to note that for thousands of years, people are constantly moving things for their own purposes, and it results in a kind of resilience. So I would say that, you know, with careful research and so on, we're just continuing that tradition, really. But then there was that. I just want to honor that. But as far as the lone woman of San Nicolas, to my understanding, the excavations of her cave did not continue; they were halted, and so there was ongoing analysis of the redwood boxes that were found that were likely her to be done. I think more subsequent work has been done in terms of looking at historic references to where Nicoleños end up in Los Angeles. And in fact, they've been traced to specific streets. So we've even been able to identify, here's probably, you know, a few families that they lived with and how they persisted in Los Angeles. So that's, I'm stepping around that because not a lot has been done archaeologically since those really important discoveries, but there's been much more research that extends that story onto the mainland. And then just as a fun fact on that note, for San Clemente Islanders, a bunch of them relocated to the Palos Verdes Peninsula, and into the 1920s, there is a named village location for San Clemente Island Peninsula, and the meaning of it's basically, this is the little island. This is little San Clemente Island. So it's not satisfying archaeologically, but there's much more of a story to tell in terms of their ongoing presence on the mainland and the persistence of island-based traditions and identities.
Yeah, yeah, that's quite some expensive real estate now. It did originally belong to the indigenous people, or still does. What would you recommend for a learning source about island linguistics? It seems like I know that David Yee is working on linguistics of the Barbareño Chumash, but the archaeologist Harrington was his first name, didn't get out there to the island. So how much do we even, I'm augmenting this question, I'm sorry, how much do we even know about the linguistics of the islands? You've told me more than I've heard before tonight.
That's pretty challenging. So the completely unsatisfying answer here is there's no singular publication to point to. And in fact, not a lot of kind of accessible published references to the number of these things. And really what's available publicly is very, very simplistic. Where there's a lot of references that are indeed in Harrington's notes, as he was obsessively collecting references to the islands. Fernando Labrado, he himself knew so much, and his ancestry in part is traced to Scorpion Anchorage. So he had much to say about Santa Cruz Islanders and place names. The other thing is that when Chumash and groups moved off the islands, they created, they entered into the mission systems, but where they went related to their island affiliation. After demissionization, some of them created island-based, their island communities on the mainland. So that island post-missionization, one of these villages was in the Ventura area. And so they were engaging in the same practices, talking about the same things, using the same terminology into the later 1800s. And this is what Fernando Labrado and others are learning about. So one way we know about things is via that post-missionization history. But more recently, there's been efforts by linguists, including Chumashan scholars, who are trying to look at different dialects and really get at the root of what these place names mean. And I'm going to reference some unpublished work at this point, and I can't share it really beyond this because it's not mine, but really looking at what references there are to place names and trying to figure out where they are and what they mean. So one that I cannot pronounce, but there's a specific place name on on Santa Cruz Island, and it relates specifically to Cueva Valdez, and it means the three mouths, basically the three mouths of the cave. So that's one, you go there, you're like, aha, this makes total sense. Yes, this is the location. So there's a few that are really, place names oftentimes reference what we call resources in the area, that what's being valued in the environment. They're not specifically this place or this person came here, but they're more so about what's in the surroundings that matters. So if you have the name itself and you can break down its etymology, then you can figure out kind of the significant, where it is, what they're talking about, and so on. So there's that effort is going on right now. So this is kind of a stay tuned. Ask that question maybe 3 to 5 years, and you'll probably have a great publication for that.
All right, and then another question about where on Santa Rosa is the storage shed with reused materials? I'm not quite, that must relate to something you said that maybe I missed, but also the perennial question that I get from people that have been to, they call themselves all 7 islanders, meaning when are you going to get me out to San Clemente, Ken? And, you know, I don't know, actually, Jennifer, do you know if they're still doing volunteer shrike surveys out there? And eventually we'll be offering some trips out there again, I'm sure.
So can I answer I'll answer the first question first really quick.
Yeah, sure, however you want.
Regarding reuse. So in the ranch complex on Santa Rosa, there's the barns, there's what's called the garage, but there's one of the barns is actually the storage area for the kind of the last important, there are other foremen after that, but Diego Cuevas, longtime foreman, hit one of his daughter, Luis Cuevas, was a longtime park ranger. She grew up on Santa Rosa, returned to the islands to be a park ranger, and has since retired. Diego Cuevas was one of these obsessive curators of useful materials. So anywhere you walk in the main ranch complex, if you see an interesting kind of problem being solved there, it's like, wow, that's kind of bolted onto that. That's probably him. But it's in one of the main barns, is thousands and thousands and thousands of bolts, screws, you name it. Some of them are already retooled, and it was just anticipating solving a future problem. So it's all right there. But I don't know if that's an exciting part of a tour. Come and look in this musty area, which has a lot of sawed-off bolts, but we've counted them. And then the other question is the all 7. I'm also an all 7. I haven't been to San Nick. And there's some who identify themselves another way. They're purists. They're all islands but Catalina, and feel like that's very important to not go there. But as far as San Clemente Island, difficult to get on. There have been periods, and I can answer this more in terms of cultural resources. Understanding of natural resource operations is a little bit different. But there were periods in which we were able to do these massive field schools, and the excavation of Eel Point took place in that context, and bring out 30 people at a time and doing all these things. We're not in that phase at this point. Right now, or as I understand it, there's so many different operations taking place on San Clemente. It's very difficult to prioritize resource management, and especially not volunteer opportunities. So I'm personally not aware, I just don't know. There could be some things, but it used to be much easier. But especially in states of war or conflict, that access tends to diminish pretty significantly. So the last time I was out there, I got to go to it's the Navy SEAL training facilities, including what I think they call the town where they do a lot of practice military operations. But the reason I was out there was very specific in a very small group, and we had to even stack up who was sleep. You know, it was down to, we have to have 2 men and 2 women to fit in the very specific space we had. So I don't know. If you find out what that opportunity is, let me know. It's not one we can just volunteer.
I actually asked Brian Munson, who's the natural resource person for Naval Base Coronado and San Clemente, if he wanted a free trip for ice plant removal this summer. But this was, you just pointed out, this was before war broke out in Europe. So but the answer was, yeah, sure, come and volunteer your time. No contract to help us defray our costs. It's extremely complicated and difficult to take a group out to any of the Navy islands. It's just massive amounts of bureaucracy and paperwork, and it really costs us a lot of staff time. It's just real money goes into that. And it's not like we can really charge people to go out with us. That would look pretty funny to the Navy if we were saying, yeah, you can come out, give us $500. But that's about how much it probably costs per person. I'm not kidding. And just paperwork time. It's just utterly amazing how much bureaucracy there is to get passes, to get on the flights, to make, figure out the timing, and just, oh my gosh. So I pasted it into the chat. I forgot her name, but somebody has a link to Mara Sullivan's work on linguistics. And then Emma Howard is our last question of the evening, unless somebody slips one in quickly here. Are there artifacts that connect the Polynesian canoe builders that may have taught the Chumash how to build canoes? So that's an interesting idea that people have, that the Polynesians actually came to North America first, or at some point. And I always think that kind of sells the Chumash short, that they had to be taught how to build tomals. I think they were very brilliant people and learned it on their own. But what do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, there's whole publications on this topic. The Chumash Polynesian nexus. There's been academic studies over this. It's a fascinating. So there's kind of two takes on it. One is you can look at Polynesian voyaging and the idea that they visited California at different points. Very likely, much easier than getting from the South Pacific to Hawaii. If you can do that, you can do just about anything else. So in terms of abilities, Polynesians definitely did so, but a lot of their colonization exploration was contingent upon finding unoccupied islands to settle. So if they did arrive, I can imagine a scenario of, well, this is full, never mind, and turning around. That could have been a very short interaction. So on the one hand, there are strings of evidence that people have cited to suggest that Polynesians did visit early on and were inspirational in terms of the technologies. Some of that is linguistic and has to do with the word tomol and breaking that down. And it aligns with kind of a Proto-Polynesian that means woodworking and sewing, which is how you construct those boats. There's a couple of other similarities in the shellfish hook styles. There's a practical reason for that shape. But I'll go back to Ken's comment, which is, certainly there's visitation and people are moving around all of the time. That is what people do. They're checking things out. And they could have very well had these interactions. It could have very well been that a Polynesian group arrived, they're looking at each other's boats, say, what do you call that? Ooh, I like that name, that's great. So it could have even been that, but it's ultimately giving credit where credit is due. And there's no suggest that Chumash or Tongva did not invent these on their own, and likely they did. It's just that there's a convergence on similarities. There's only so many ways you can build a boat like that in the absence of large straight trees. So if you do not have redwoods, if you don't have the equivalent of tree species in the Pacific Northwest, where we have these giant dugouts, there's kind of a set way that you'd have to approach shoring up the side of a canoe to make it. There's other things that just say that this is an adaptation. I would argue that it's a local adaptation to the circumstances here. And so really just being astounded, while I love looking at similarities, it's really giving that credit for innovativeness. I will acknowledge there's some very interesting similarities in material culture between our Channel Islands and areas in northern Chile. Very fascinating, down to very specific artifact types. And what that begs the question of kind of the earliest colonization efforts or peopling of the Americas and how quickly that took place. So we could be looking at a very coastal or maritime signature of people as they're migrating along the coastlines. Unclear at this point, but I also wanted to note that as well, is that is that what's out there is, I mean, the research is never ending. Somebody asked me years ago, how could there possibly be enough on the Channel Islands for your entire career? And I just laughed and said, this is just we're just beginning. We're just beginning and understanding all this.
Yeah, it's almost like you're describing convergent evolution in an ecological sense, that
Yeah.
early botanists would look at plants that were incredibly similar looking and morphologically almost identical and believe that they're related, but it just so happens like jade plant and cactus are both succulents, but they're not related at all. One is from South Africa, one is from North America or the Americas, but succulent plants are, or maybe I should say dudley, as an example, because it doesn't have spines. So yeah, things adapt naturally to the environment. Why wouldn't people? I like Ray Klein's point, though, as you could, couldn't you use DNA to figure out how related the Chumash are to Polynesians? And
Yeah,
that would answer that.
yeah, and there is effort on ancestral DNA, and so far that association has not been demonstrated. What I do think is interesting is one is, we can argue likely, if from an archaeological perspective, that there's been a continuation of Chumash identity, Chumash community, Chumash descendancy for thousands and thousands of years. That is, and likely they're associated with the original peoples of the island. So that's really amazing. And they are genetically related to other coastal societies, including in the Pacific Northwest. So in some ways, they're more genetically similar, the Haida and other groups in the Pacific Northwest, than they are to the immediate neighbors, the Tongva, with whom they intermarry later on. So that's just there are hints and whispers of kind of a coastal tradition that the Chumash come from. We know less about the Tongva. More research has been done on the Chumash than Tongva origins, and there's some interesting things there. So that's why I answered it in that way.
So the Tongva, from what I read, migrated from the interior of the continent, correct?
That is, I'm being careful there because there are a lot of archaeologists who strongly support that. There's some important commonalities in what is known as the Uto-Aztecan linguistic tradition. So if you kind of want to look at material culture and linguistic similarities, that is a compelling story. There is definitely a contingent of people who say that's not really fair, and it gives primacy to the Chumash, and we really don't know the answer to that. So I'm going to dance around that one and saying we don't know yet, and it's just that's been kind of the narrative at this point, is the Tongva are more recent migrants to the islands, but that tends to erode a sense of connection to them. So I don't know, but more importantly, there's some really interesting variations across the islands in terms of Chumash and Tongva identities, and that's worth exploring further.
Well, Jennifer, 80 people hung out to even listen to our talk afterwards here, so that's nice. I'm really appreciative of your talk tonight. It obviously really got a good audience, and people were really interested. I was really interested, and stimulated a lot of questions on my side too, and a lot of neat conversation. And we had a little before we even started the webinar. We were talking. So if you want to hear more from Dr. Perry, maybe we'll get her to come out with us again on the autumn equinox trip to Santa Rosa. I hope so, because she as I said, led a walk there and for us last year, and she's the right person to do that if you want to learn about anthropology. And also, if you don't, if you're not one of these hikers who want to run down to the Torrey Pines and run back in time to catch the boat, and want a more easy walk around the ranch. So that's why I was sticking with her. No.
And I much rather do this. This is most unsatisfying because of not, while we can engage in the Q&A, we're not having a meaningful, robust conversation as a community. And so that's not very, very satisfying for me. Here we are talking about the human story. And what I love, what would be the ideal is we're standing out on the islands and talking through this in real time and staring at things and kind of engaging with that. So that's my only lament in this situation is we don't get to do that. So stay tuned. Maybe I'll see you guys on the islands.
All right. Well, with that, we'll close it up for tonight. Thank you again, Dr. Jennifer Perry, for presenting. And again, go to cirweb.org/webinars or to our Facebook and YouTube pages to find this presentation. On our website, it'll show up in a few days once Maury Spellman, our marketing manager, gets it up there, but should be available right away on Facebook and YouTube. So thank you again, everyone, for coming tonight, attending tonight, viewing tonight. And once again, thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Have a great night, everyone.
You
Bye-bye.
too.